When the most powerful man in the world woke up at 4:47 in the morning, it was not to a rocket launch. It was not to a board meeting or a billion-dollar deal or any of the things you would expect to pull Elon Musk out of sleep. It was a phone call. 3 words on the other end of the line stopped everything. They froze everything. Not one account, not one company. 642 accounts, frozen solid, all at the same time, in the middle of the night, while most of America was asleep. SpaceX, Tesla, the Boring Company, personal trust funds, all of it, gone, locked, untouchable. Somewhere between $40 and $60 billion, just gone. And here's the part that will make your jaw drop. The person who did it was not a judge, not a senator, not some powerful government official with decades of experience and a team of 100 lawyers behind them. It was one woman, 31 years old, 11 months on the job, working out of a small regional office in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. She drove a dented Honda Civic. She brought homemade red beans and rice to work in a glass container with a blue lid. She had 2 plants on her desk that she talked to when the office got quiet. She had no team. No one told her to do it. No one was even watching. She did it alone. At 4:15 in the morning, after 3 weeks of late nights, a spreadsheet so big it crashed her laptop twice, and a phone call to a professor that left them both sitting in silence. And when it was done, when $60 billion belonging to the most famous man on earth was frozen solid, she turned off her lamp. Henri went to bed, set her alarm, and came in the next morning at her regular time. She said good morning to her supervisor. She asked if his weekend was good. She ate her breakfast at her desk, like nothing had happened. Within hours, senators were shouting. Wall Street was shaking. Cable news anchors were saying her name on live television. The whole world wanted to know who she was and why she had done it and whether she had just made the biggest mistake of her life. But here is what nobody knew yet. She had found something buried so deep inside layer after layer of legal paperwork that dozens of trained experts had walked right past it for 11 years without seeing it. Something that pointed to a number so large that even the professor she called, a woman who had spent her whole career studying exactly this kind of thing, went completely silent on the phone when she heard it. And when Elon Musk finally sat alone in a back office and read every single page of what this woman had built, all 114 pages, he came out of that room and said 2 words that nobody in that building was prepared to hear. He said she was right. But that is not even the most shocking part of this story, because buried at the very end of that document, on page 107, was something that had nothing to do with taxes. Something that this woman had found completely by accident at 1 a.m. in her kitchen. Something so personal, so private, so unexpected, that when Elon Musk read it, watch, it changed everything. Not just the legal fight. Everything. Within 48 hours of the freeze, the agents who had come to bring this woman down were sitting across from her with their heads low. Politicians who had called for her removal were standing at podiums struggling to find words. And Elon Musk, the man with $60 billion on the line, was doing something that nobody in the history of this story could have predicted. What was on page 107? What did she find at 1 a.m. that was powerful enough to change the mind of the most stubborn, driven, relentless builder on the planet? And what exactly did Elon Musk do in the 48th hour that made grown men in suits sit down and beg? Stay with us through this entire video, because the answer is going to surprise you. And once you hear it, you are not going to forget it. Priscilla Vance did not look like someone who could shake the world. She was 31 years old, 5 feet 4 inches tall, and had a habit of bringing homemade red beans and rice to work in a glass container with a blue lid. She drove a 2019 Honda Civic with a dent on the rear bumper from a parking lot in 2021 that she still had not gotten fixed. She wore her hair natural, pulled up with a yellow scrunchie she had owned since college. On her desk at the Baton Rouge Regional IRS office, she kept 2 plants, a pothos named Gerald and a succulent named General Tso, and she talked to both of them when the office got quiet, which was most of the afternoon. Her supervisor, Harold Fitch, had written in her last performance review, "Priscilla is detail-oriented, conscientious, high and occasionally too thorough. He meant it as a mild criticism, a gentle nudge toward efficiency, a suggestion that she move faster and dig less. He would later frame that performance review and hang it on his office wall. Not as a joke, as a reminder of the most spectacular understatement of his entire career. Priscilla had not wanted to work for the IRS. She had wanted to be a marine biologist. Growing up in Thibodaux, Louisiana, a small warm town about an hour southwest of New Orleans, she had spent her childhood 3 blocks from a bayou that smelled like rain and crawfish and something permanently, magnificently alive. She caught small turtles with her bare hands and set them back carefully on the same log. She named them. She named everything. When on the ceiling above her bed, she had taped a poster of a blue whale that she had cut from a National Geographic when she was 7 years old. The whale's name was Theodora. She was still named Theodora. The poster was still on the ceiling of her childhood room, a little curled at the edges now, but holding on. Priscilla had been 22 in the last semester of her senior year at LSU when her mother got sick. Lymphoma. Stage 3. Diagnosed on a Tuesday in February, which was a cold and gray month in Louisiana, which is not a state built for cold gray months. The diagnosis came with a treatment plan came with a cost, and the cost came with paperwork, mountains of it, an avalanche of forms and codes and appeal letters, and prior authorization requests that arrived in white envelopes that Priscilla's mother, Miss Celestine, would stack on the kitchen table and stare at with the careful, exhausted patience of a woman who had already learned that certain battles had to be fought sitting down. Priscilla sat down beside her and started fighting. She read every document. She called every number. She found the errors and the overcharges and the denied claims that should not have been denied. She sat on hold for 4 hours on a Tuesday and got back $1,400 that the insurance company had said, incorrectly, was not covered. She did this while finishing her thesis and working weekends at a restaurant on Highland Road and driving 2 hours round trip to Thibodaux every Thursday to be there when her mother's fatigue was worst. Somewhere in all of that, in the phone calls and the white envelopes and the 4-hour hold music, something shifted in her. Not quietly. It shifted the way the ground shifts when something underneath it moves, deep and permanent and not entirely comfortable. She switched her graduate school plans. She studied tax law and public finance. She told her mother it was practical, which was true, but not the whole truth. The whole truth was that she had looked at the system her mother was drowning in and understood, bone deep, that it had been built piece by piece over many years by people making choices, and that different choices could have built something different, and that someone somewhere had to be in the room where those choices were made and ask, "But is this fair?" Celestine listened to the explanation and said, on with the voice of a woman who had made peace with most of the universe, "Baby, you don't have to save everyone." Priscilla said, "I know, Mama, but maybe I can make it a little more fair." Celestine had been in remission for 6 years now. She still called Priscilla every Sunday and still asked about the plants. After graduate school, Priscilla spent 3 years at a nonprofit tax advocacy clinic in New Orleans, sitting at kitchen tables and folding tables set up in church halls, helping people understand letters that had been written to confuse them and find money that had been taken from them incorrectly. She was good at it in a way that was hard to explain. A combination of patience and precision, and a total inability to believe that something complicated was therefore something untouchable. She joined the IRS at 30. Then Harold Fitch, who interviewed her, told her later that she had asked more questions in that interview than any candidate he had ever spoken to. He had taken that as a good sign. He was right, just not in the way he expected. She was not like her colleagues. She noticed things they did not notice. She followed threads they tied off because the threads seemed thin and the knots seemed tight and moving on seemed easier. She asked why one more time than most people thought was necessary and found that the extra why was almost always the one that mattered. It was a thread that brought her to Elon Musk, not because anyone told her to, not because she had a plan or an agenda or any idea at 2:14 p.m. on a Tuesday in October that a puzzling deduction in a mid-sized government subcontractor's audit file was about to pull her somewhere enormous. It looked like nothing, less than $40,000, A rounding error by the standards of the files on her desk. But the number didn't add up. And Priscilla Vance, who had been adding up numbers other people skipped since she was 22 years old on a cold Tuesday in February, sitting next to her mother at a kitchen table full of white envelopes. Priscilla Vance could not let a number that didn't add up simply sit there. She looked at Gerald the Pothos. "What are you?" she said, meaning the deduction, not the plant. Gerald said nothing. Priscilla opened a new spreadsheet, and that was how it started. The spreadsheet started small. 1 tab, 12 rows. Sorry, a single column of numbers that did not behave the way numbers were supposed to behave. Priscilla named the file thread.xlsx. She always named her working files with one plain word so she could find them fast. She had files named Bridge and Hollow and Knot. She had one she had worked on for 6 weeks last spring that she called Ghost, because the money in it kept disappearing and reappearing in ways that felt less like accounting and more like haunting. Thread was different from all of them. She felt it within the first hour, the way a fisherwoman feels before she can explain it, that something real is on the other end of the line. The deduction was $40,000. It had been claimed by a mid-sized government subcontractor in Virginia, a company that built communications equipment for federal agencies and filed clean, unremarkable returns year after year. Priscilla was reviewing it as part of a routine audit flag, the kind of flag that gets generated automatically when a deduction category is slightly unusual. She could have reviewed it, noted it, cleared it, and been done in 40 minutes. Instead, she followed it. The deduction pointed to a subsidiary. The subsidiary was incorporated in Delaware and had a name that sounded like a law firm but was not. The name was Aldrin Capital Solutions. It had filed its own returns separately, and those returns were clean too, on the surface. But the subsidiary pointed to a holding company registered in the Cayman Islands. The holding company had a name that was just a string of letters, VRCX Holdings LLC, which was the kind of name that meant it was built to be hard to search for and easy to overlook. The VRCX Holdings pointed to 3 trusts. The trust pointed to a financial instrument that Priscilla had never seen before. Not in 3 years at the clinic, not in a year at the IRS, not in any textbook or case study or seminar she had attended. She printed it out, 12 pages. She put it on her desk next to Gerald. "What are you?" she said. This time she was not being rhetorical. She called Dr. Annies Moreau at LSU on a Thursday evening from her apartment, sitting cross-legged on her kitchen floor, because that was where she sat when she needed to think hard. Dr. Moreau had been her professor in graduate school. She was 61 years old, had written 4 books on offshore financial structures, and had the habit of asking sharper questions than most people could answer. Priscilla trusted her more than almost anyone in her professional life, because Dr. Moreau had never once told her that something was too complicated to keep pulling at. She described the instrument. She did not name the company or the subcontractor. She described only the mechanics, the layering, the trust arrangement, the way the instrument created what she could only call a financial shadow, a place where income could exist legally but be invisible to standard audit detection. Dr. Moreau went quiet for long enough that Priscilla checked the phone to make sure the call had not dropped. "Are you still there?" Priscilla asked. "I'm here," Dr. Moreau said. "I'm thinking." More silence. "Priscilla," Dr. Moreau said finally, "how large is the entity that originated this structure?" "I don't know yet," Priscilla said. "I'm still following the thread." "Follow it faster," Dr. Moreau said. Her voice had changed. It was quieter, more careful. "What you're describing, if you're reading the mechanics correctly, and I believe you are, is a structure designed to make taxable income legally invisible. Not illegal. Legal. Every layer of it would pass a standard review because every layer of it was built by someone who understood exactly how standard reviews work." "And if it's been used at scale?" Priscilla asked. "For a long time?" Dr. Moreau was quiet again. "Say a number," Priscilla said. "I don't want to," Dr. Moreau said. "Say it anyway." Dr. Moreau said a number. Priscilla sat very still on her kitchen floor. The refrigerator hummed. Outside her window, the Baton Rouge evening was warm and orange and smelled faintly like the river. "Okay," Priscilla said softly, not to Dr. Moreau, to herself. to the room, to whatever was waiting at the end of the thread. Okay. She did not sleep well that night. She lay in her bed and stared at the ceiling and thought about the structure. She thought about how it was built and by whom, and over how many years, and how many people had walked past it assuming someone else had already checked. She thought about all the money that had moved through it and what that money had not become on the other side, what programs it had not funded, what gaps it had not filled, what white envelopes it had arrived as on someone else's kitchen table. She got up at 5 a.m. and went back to the spreadsheet. The next 3 weeks were the strangest of her life, and her life had already contained some strange weeks. She worked thread every evening and every weekend, and most of her lunch breaks. The spreadsheet grew. It cracked her laptop once. She borrowed a charging cable from Harold, and he asked what she was working on, and she said, an audit follow-up, which was technically true. Thread grew a second tab, then a third, then a tab just for the entities and their relationships, which she color-coded in a system that made complete sense to her and would have looked to anyone else like abstract art. 3 weeks in, on a Wednesday night at 11:30, she found the name. It was not hidden exactly. Nothing in the structure was hidden in the way that illegal things are hidden. It was obscured, buried under layers that each looked reasonable alone. You had to hold all the layers together at once, in your head, to see what they added up to. Most people could not do that. Most people were not built to hold that much complexity at once without losing the thread. Priscilla was built exactly like that. The name was at the center of 7 years of filings, running through the trusts, echoing through the holding companies, present at the origin of the instrument that Dr. Moreau had gone quiet about. The name was Elon Musk. She sat with it for 4 days. She walked around her apartment with it. She ate dinner across from it. She tried to sleep next to it. She took Gerald to the window twice and held the pot in both hands and looked at the city lights and thought about what it meant to find something this large and this real and to be the only person in the room who could see it. On the 4th night, a Sunday, she sat at her kitchen table with a cup of tea that went cold before she touched it, and she opened her laptop. She called her mother first. "Mama," she said when Celestine picked up, "what do you do when you find something so big you're scared to touch it?" Celestine was quiet for a moment, not the quiet of someone who doesn't know what to say, the quiet of someone who is choosing the right words slowly and carefully, the way you choose your footing on a path you cannot see clearly. "You found it, didn't you, baby?" Celestine said. It was not a question. "Yes," Priscilla said. "Then it was supposed to be found," Celestine said, "and it was supposed to be found by you, because you're the one who didn't walk past it." Priscilla pressed the phone against her ear and closed her eyes. "I'm scared." "Mama." "I know you are," Celestine said. "Do it anyway." They stayed on the phone for another 20 minutes, talking about nothing in particular. The weather, the neighbor's dog, whether Priscilla was getting enough sleep. The ordinary, warm, necessary things that hold people together when everything else is big and cold and uncertain. After she hung up, Priscilla made a fresh cup of tea. She opened the document. She began to write. She worked until 3 a.m. She filed at 4:15 a.m. Eastern Time. She turned off her lamp, washed her face, set her alarm, and went to bed. 642 accounts, frozen simultaneously. At 4:47 a.m., a phone rang in Austin, Texas. And the world, which had been spinning the same way for a very long time, quietly began to spin a little differently. And the document Priscilla built was 114 pages long. She had started it the way she started everything, with one plain word at the top of a blank page. The word was thread, same as the spreadsheet. She liked consistency. She liked being able to look at something and know exactly where it came from and what it had cost her. It had cost her 3 weeks of evenings, 2 cracked laptop charging sessions, 1 phone call to Dr. Moreau that had gone 90 minutes long and left them both silent at the end in the particular way that silence arrives when 2 people have understood something enormous at the same time. It had cost her sleep and appetite and 3 separate Sunday calls to Celestine, where she had said everything was fine, and which was true in the ways that mattered, and not true in the ways that kept her up at 2 a.m. with a pen in her hand and a legal pad on her knee. The document had footnotes. It had color-coded spreadsheet attachments that she had cross-referenced 17 times to make sure every number pointed to a real source, and every source pointed back to a real document, and every document was in the file, and the file was organized so clearly that anyone, any judge, any commissioner, any person pulled off the street and handed the thing, could open it and follow it from the first page to the last without getting lost. This was not an accident. Priscilla had written the document to be understood, not just by lawyers and commissioners and people who use the word fiduciary the way other people use the word the. She had written it for her mother, for the woman she had helped in the Ninth Ward 3 years ago who owed $4,000 she did not have because of a clerical error that had been sitting in a system for 6 years. For the man in Thibodaux who drove a delivery truck for 41 years and paid every cent of his taxes every single April and never once thought to wonder why the rules felt different depending on how much money you started with. She had written it for them, in language they could read, in sentences that were short enough to breathe between. There was also, in the margin of page 31, a hand-drawn diagram. She had done it at 1 a.m. with a blue ballpoint pen because she had been staring at the financial structure on her screen for 3 hours, and her eyes had gone soft, and her brain had stopped reading numbers as numbers and started reading them as shapes. So she drew the shapes. She drew the 7 layers of the structure as a series of circles inside circles, with arrows showing where the money flowed and small labels in her careful handwriting showing what each layer was called and what it was designed to do. It looked a little like a solar system, a small center surrounded by rings. She almost left it out. It felt too casual, too hand-drawn for a document this serious. But at 1:30 a.m., she decided to keep it, because it was the clearest version of the whole thing she had managed to make. And clarity was the point. And it did not matter what it looked like as long as it worked. It worked. But Priscilla did not know that yet, on the morning she filed it. She did not know that a man in Austin, Texas would read all 114 pages of it alone in a back office with a legal pad and 14 pages of his own handwritten notes. She did not know he would circle the hand-drawn diagram on page 31 and stare at it for 6 full minutes. She did not know he would describe it later to his legal team as the clearest part of the whole document. She did not know any of that at 4:15 a.m. when she filed the freeze order and turned off her lamp and went to bed. She found out gradually the way most things in her life had arrived, not in a single dramatic moment, but in pieces, each one a little heavier than the last. The first piece arrived at 11 a.m. the next morning. Harold Fitch came to her desk with both his hands pressed together in front of his face, as if he were praying or trying to keep his head from floating away. He was a man of medium height and medium build and deeply unmedium anxiety, and his face at that moment was the color of old chalk. "Priscilla," he said, "the Elon Musk freeze. That was you." It was not a question, but she answered it like one. "Yes," she said. Harold sat down in the empty chair beside her desk, the chair that no one ever sat in because Priscilla's desk was positioned slightly apart from the others, not by anyone's design, but simply because she had asked to move it 2 inches to the left in her first week so she could see the window, and the 2 inches had become, over time, a kind of quiet perimeter that people respected without knowing they were respecting it. Harold sat in the chair inside the perimeter. He did not speak for 31 seconds. Priscilla counted, not because she was impatient, because counting was what her brain did when it was waiting. "Walk me through it," Harold finally said. She walked him through it. She started at the $40,000 deduction, and she followed the thread the same way she had followed it for 3 weeks, calmly and in order, one layer at a time, each one connecting to the next the way a staircase connects to itself. You cannot see the top from the bottom, but every step is real and every step holds you. Harold listened without interrupting, which was unusual for Harold, who interrupted people in the gentle, reflexive way that some men do when they are used to being the one who explains things rather than the one who is explained to. He did not interrupt once. When she finished, he sat in the chair for another long moment. Then he said, "Did you consult with anyone internally before filing?" "I tried to," Priscilla said. She kept her voice even. She had decided at some point during the 3 weeks of late nights that she would tell this part plainly and without drama, when it came time to tell it. About 3 weeks ago, when I had the early structure identified, I brought it to a senior agent and described what I was seeing. Harold's face changed. Who? I'd rather not say without speaking to the union rep first, she said. Harold nodded. He understood that. He was not a bad man. He understood the importance of doing things in the right order. What did the senior agent say? He asked. Priscilla looked at Gerald. The pothos sat in its terracotta pot and said nothing, and swayed slightly in the air conditioning. He said it was probably a legitimate tax planning instrument, she said. He said structures like that exist for valid business reasons, and that I should focus on my assigned caseload and not follow threads that hadn't been flagged for investigation. Harold was quiet. So you followed it anyway, he said. The numbers didn't add up, Priscilla said simply. When numbers don't add up, I add them again. Harold stood up slowly, the way people stand when they have been sitting with something heavy, and the standing is an effort not just of the body but of everything else too. I need to make some calls, he said. I know, Priscilla said. He went to his desk. He sat down. He picked up his phone. He looked at Priscilla once more across the office, at her desk with Gerald and General So, and the glass container with the blue lid, and his expression held something she had not seen on Harold's face before. It was not anger. It was not relief. It was the particular look of a man beginning to understand that something very large has been sitting in the room with him for a long time, and he had not known it was there. He made his calls. By 1 p.m., 2 men in dark suits arrived at the regional office. Their names were Vincent Torr and Al Begay, and they were from the IRS Legal Enforcement Division, which was a division that most agents went their entire careers without meeting in person. Sooner, they carried briefcases and expressions that were working very hard to be professionally neutral and not quite succeeding. They set up in the small conference room beside the copy machine. They asked for Priscilla Vance. She picked up her lunch container, told Gerald she would be back shortly, and walked to the conference room. Vincent Torr opened a folder. Al Begay uncapped a pen, and Priscilla sat down across from them and folded her hands on the table and looked at them with the calm, clear eyes of someone who has nothing to hide and knows exactly how to prove it. Ms. Vance, Vincent said, we need to understand the full scope of your investigation. Okay, said Priscilla. Where would you like me to start? Outside the window. Baton Rouge went on being itself, warm and wide and smelling faintly of the river that had been running through it for longer than anyone could remember. Somewhere across town, Celestine Vance was watching the news and seeing her daughter's name scroll across the bottom of the screen for the very first time. She turned the volume up. She pressed her hand flat against her chest, and she smiled. The conference room beside the copy machine was small and smelled like old coffee and printer toner, and the particular staleness of a room that was used only when something had gone wrong. Vincent Torr sat on the left. Al Begay sat on the right. Between them on the table was a stack of documents 2 inches thick, a voice recorder the size of a deck of cards, and 2 paper cups of water that neither of them touched. Priscilla sat across from them with her hands folded and her lunch container on the chair beside her, because there had been nowhere else to put it, and she had not finished eating. The red beans and rice were cold now. She ate them anyway between questions, because she was hungry and because she had learned a long time ago that the body's needs do not pause for the mind's emergencies. Vincent asked questions in the careful, layered way of someone trained to find the gaps between answers. He asked about the originating audit flag. He asked about the Virginia subcontractor. He asked about each entity in the chain: Aldrin Capital Solutions, VRCX Holdings, the 3 trusts, and how she had identified them and in what order and using which databases and on which dates. Priscilla answered everything, completely in order, with the file numbers and the access timestamps and the names of the databases she had used, because she had written all of those things down as she went. In a separate log she kept specifically, because she believed that the work you do in the dark should be able to hold up in any light. Al Begay wrote very fast. He filled 4 pages of his legal pad in the first 40 minutes. He had the handwriting of someone who had taken a lot of notes in a lot of rooms and learned to make every word count. Ms. Vance, Vincent said about an hour in, at what point did you identify the primary liable entity? 3 weeks into the investigation, Priscilla said. A Wednesday night, 11:32 p.m., according to my log. And the primary liable entity is Elon Musk. The primary liable entity associated with the structure. Yes, Priscilla said. The structure itself spans multiple legal persons and entities. But the origin point, the beneficial ownership at the center of the instrument, traces to him. Vincent made a note. And between identifying that name and filing the freeze order, how much time passed? 4 days, Priscilla said. What did you do during those 4 days? Priscilla considered the question. She thought about her apartment, about walking from the kitchen to the living room and back again, with the name sitting in her chest like a stone, about the cold tea on the kitchen table, about Gerald on the windowsill and the city lights beyond him and the river she couldn't see, but knew was out there, running dark and steady in the dark. I made sure I was right, she said. I went through the documentation 4 more times. I contacted Dr. Anise Moreau at LSU. She's a specialist in offshore financial structures, and walked her through the mechanics without disclosing the entity name. I verified the legal basis for the emergency freeze provision under Section 7811 subsection F, and I thought about whether I was doing this for the right reasons. Al looked up from his legal pad. It was the first time he had looked up in an hour. And were you? He asked. Doing it for the right reasons? It was not the kind of question that people in his position usually asked. It was too human for the room, too honest for the stack of documents and the voice recorder and the 2 untouched cups of water. Priscilla looked at him directly. Yes, she said. I was. Al held her gaze for a moment. Then he looked back down at his legal pad and kept writing. To Vincent clicked his pen. We'll need access to all working files. The full thread documentation, the spreadsheet attachments, the correspondence with Dr. Moreau, and the investigation log. I'll have everything transferred to you within the hour, Priscilla said. I organized it for exactly this kind of review. Everything is labeled and cross-referenced. There's a reading guide on the first page that explains the filing structure. Vincent blinked. A reading guide. So you don't have to spend time figuring out where things are, Priscilla said. You can spend the time on the content instead. Vincent and Al looked at each other across the table. It was a brief look, the kind that passes between 2 people who have just understood something about a third person that changes the shape of the room slightly. It was at this exact moment, 2:47 p.m. Central Time, that Priscilla's work phone buzzed on the table in front of her. She looked at the screen. Austin, Texas area code, a number she did not recognize. She looked at Vincent. She looked at Al. I should take this, she said. Vincent frowned. We're in the middle of... I think I should take this, she said again. Not louder, just more certain. She picked up the phone. Priscilla Vance, she said. A pause on the other end. Not long. 2 seconds, maybe 3. But the kind of pause that has weight in it. Then a voice said, Ms. Vance, this is Elon Musk. Vincent Torr dropped his pen. It hit the table and rolled to the edge and stopped. He did not pick it up. He sat completely still, staring at the side of Priscilla's face, as if by watching her closely enough, he could hear both sides of the conversation. Al Begay sat forward so fast that his chair scraped the floor with a sound like a small shout. Priscilla did not react to either of them. Hello, Mr. Musk, she said. Her voice was the same as it had been for the past hour. Calm, even. The voice of someone who had been ready for this, not because she had planned it, but because she had spent 3 weeks preparing herself for whatever came at the end of the thread. I've been expecting someone to call. Have you? He said. It was not quite a question. Yes, she said, though I wasn't sure it would be you directly. I read your document, he said. Something shifted in Priscilla's chest, small but real, like a door opening a single inch. All of it, she asked. When all 114 pages, he said, including the hand-drawn diagram on page 31. The door opened a little wider. I wasn't sure whether to include that, she said. It was the clearest part, he said. Across the table, Vincent had still not picked up his pen. Al had stopped writing. The voice recorder sat between them, its small red light blinking steadily, catching everything. Elon spoke first, the way he always did in rooms that mattered. Not with anger, not with the weight of lawyers and press releases and carefully managed statements. just directly. Like a man who had read something that required a direct response and had decided to give it. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I need you to answer honestly, even if you think I won't like it." "All right," Priscilla said. "Why did you keep going?" he asked. 3 weeks in on a case nobody assigned you. Nobody watching. Nobody who would have noticed if you stopped. Why didn't you stop?" The conference room was so quiet that Priscilla could hear the copy machine in the hallway cycling through its warm-up rotation, the low mechanical hum of it like a held breath. She thought about the $40,000 deduction that didn't add up. She thought about Gerald on the windowsill and the river she couldn't see. She thought about Celestine at the kitchen table with the white envelopes stacked in front of her, working her way through them with the quiet, focused courage of a woman who could not afford to be defeated by paper. "My mother got sick when I was 22, Priscilla said. "Cancer. And I watched her fight the disease and fight the paperwork at the same time. And I understood that the paperwork was not an accident. It had been built carefully by people making choices over many years. And some of those choices had made things harder for people who were already carrying enough." She paused. "What your financial team built, it's sophisticated and it's largely legal, but it moved money away from a pool that funds things like Medicaid treatment for cancer patients in Louisiana. That's not abstract to me, Mr. Musk. That's my mother. That's real." The silence that followed was long enough that Vincent finally, slowly, bent down and picked up his pen. When Elon spoke again, his voice was different. Not softer exactly, more still. The way water goes still when it is very deep. I didn't think of it that way," he said. "I know," Priscilla said. "That's part of how the structure works. It stays invisible by staying complicated." "You made it visible," he said. "I tried," she said. Another silence. Outside the window, a cloud moved across the Baton Rouge sky, and the light in the conference room changed for a moment. Dimmer, then bright again. Just a second. Just the world doing what the world does, turning and shifting and going on regardless. "Ms. Vance," Elon said, "my legal team is going to fight this. I have boards and shareholders and employees and fiduciary responsibilities that don't give me the option of simply—" "I know," Priscilla said. "I'm not asking you not to fight it. I'm asking for the fight to happen in the open, in courts, with the documentation on the table for anyone to see. Because if it's in the open, then it becomes a conversation this country has to have. Not just about you, about the system, about why it was possible." Elon said nothing for a moment. "You're not just trying to collect taxes," he said. "No," said Priscilla Vance. "I'm trying to make it a little more fair." The words landed in the room and stayed there. Vincent Torr looked at Al Begay. Al Begay looked at his legal pad. The voice recorder blinked its small red light, and on the other end of the line, in a back office in Austin, Texas, a man pressed his hand flat against a legal pad covered in his own handwriting and sat with those words, "A little more fair," the way you sit with something that is simple and true and that you have not heard in a very long time. The call went on for another 26 minutes. When it ended, Priscilla set the phone down on the table. The conference room was still. The copy machine had stopped its humming. Outside the window, the Baton Rouge afternoon had gone golden wide. Vincent cleared his throat. "What did he say?" he asked. "He said he read my document," Priscilla said. "All 114 pages. And—" She thought about the stillness in his voice at the end, about the word fair sitting between them on the phone line like a stone dropped into deep water, sending rings outward that neither of them could yet see the edges of. "I think he's thinking," she said. She picked up her lunch container. The red beans and rice were very cold now. She ate the last of them anyway, at the conference table. While Vincent and Al gathered their papers and the voice recorder blinked and the gold afternoon light came through the window and lay itself across the floor like it belonged there. Because it did. By the morning of the second day, the freeze had become the biggest story in the world. Not just America, the world. In London, the Financial Times ran it on the front page beneath a headline that used the word seismic and meant it. In Tokyo, it led the evening news between a typhoon warning and a trade summit update, and somehow it felt more urgent than either. In Brussels, finance ministers were pulled from a lunch that had taken 3 months to schedule and placed in an emergency briefing room with bad coffee and good reason to be afraid. In a small village outside Nairobi, a man who ran a mobile phone repair shop from a blue metal container read the headline on his screen, showed it to the man fixing a bicycle outside, and said simply, "Even the biggest fish." The bicycle man nodded. "Even them," he said. Back in America, the story had cracked open into 3 separate stories, all running at the same time, all pulling in different directions, all claiming to be the real one. The first story was the legal story. It lived in courtrooms and conference rooms and the offices of people who wore reading glasses on chains around their necks and billed by the hour. It asked precise, airless questions. Could the freeze hold under judicial review? Was Section 7811 subsection F properly applied? Would an emergency injunction succeed, and on what timeline? This story mattered enormously and was almost impossible to care about if you were not personally a lawyer, which most people were not. The second story was the political story. It lived in hearing rooms and press briefing podiums and the long marble hallways of buildings where people walked fast to look important. Senators from both parties were shouting, which was the one thing senators from both parties could reliably be counted on to do regardless of what the shouting was about. Some said the IRS had gone rogue, weaponized itself, overreached in a way that threatened every business in America and should be investigated immediately and possibly disbanded. Others said this was precisely what the IRS existed to do, hold powerful people to the same standard as everyone else, and that anyone arguing otherwise was making the powerful person's argument for them and should be asked directly, on camera, why. Committee hearings were scheduled. Press secretaries issued statements that said a great deal and meant very little. The White House said nothing officially and a great deal unofficially, in side conversations and off-record phone calls, and the particular pointed silences of people who have opinions they are not yet ready to own in public. The third story was the human story, and the human story was eating the world alive. Priscilla Vance's name had gotten out sometime in the early hours of the second morning. Nobody knew exactly how. These things rarely had clean origins. One person told another person who told a reporter who told an editor who decided at 3 a.m. that this was the story beneath the story and started making calls. The reporter was a woman named Celeste Park. She worked for a national newspaper that had been around for 130 years and still believed that a good story told fully and honestly was the most important thing a person could put into the world. She had been a reporter for 11 years. She had covered wars and elections and the slow, grinding disasters that don't make the front page because they happen too gradually to be called news. She was not easily moved. She was moved by Priscilla Vance. She wrote a piece that ran at 6 a.m. on the second day under the headline, "The Woman Who Followed the Thread, How a First-Year Agent Changed American History." It was 5,200 words long. It mentioned Thibodeau. It mentioned Celestine and the lymphoma and the white envelopes on the kitchen table. It mentioned 3 years at the nonprofit clinic in New Orleans. It mentioned Gerald the Pathos and General Tuo, the succulent, and the spreadsheet that crashed her laptop twice. It mentioned the yellow scrunchie. It mentioned the glass container with the blue lid. It was careful and accurate and reported from 6 separate sources, none of whom were Priscilla, who had declined to speak with any media on the advice of the IRS legal team, and who would have declined anyway because she did not think of herself as a story. The internet decided otherwise. By 7 a.m., the piece had been shared 400,000 times. By 9 a.m., it was 1 million. By noon, it had been translated into 11 languages by volunteers who had done it unprompted because they thought people in other countries deserved to know. A woman in Sao Paulo read it and cried on the bus. A retired accountant in Manchester printed it and left it on his neighbor's doorstep with a note that said only, "Read this." A 16-year-old in Seoul who wanted to study finance read it 3 times and then wrote in her diary, "Today I decided what kind of person I want to be at work." There were TikTok videos. There were Twitter threads that ran to 40 posts and were screenshot and shared by people who never used Twitter. There was a Reddit post in a community dedicated to houseplants. 40,000 members who love plants the way other people love sports teams. That said simply, "One of us saved the world," with a picture of a pothos and a link to the article. And it received 61,000 upvotes and a comment thread so warm, it felt like a fireplace. There were also people who were not warm. A loud group said the freeze was a political attack dressed up as tax law. A louder group said Priscilla was being used, a pawn in a game she did not understand, that she would be discarded when she was no longer useful, and that the people celebrating her now would not be there when the consequences arrived. A smaller but sharper group said things that were not about the taxes at all, and that we will not repeat here, because they do not deserve the space. Priscilla did not read any of it. She did not own a television. She did not have social media accounts, which had seemed like a small odd quirk before, and now seemed like the single wisest decision of her adult life. She came into work on the second morning the same way she had come in on the first. On time, with her lunch, wearing the yellow scrunchie, saying good morning to Harold, asking if his weekend had been good even though it was Tuesday, and the weekend felt like a different century. She reviewed her other caseload. She answered the questions that Vincent and Al sent through the internal document system. She talked to Gerald at 2 p.m. when the office got quiet. She told him that things were loud out there and that she was grateful for the quiet in here. Gerald swayed gently in the air conditioning. At 3 p.m., Harold came to her desk again. He sat in the chair again, the chair inside the perimeter, and he looked at his hands for a moment before he spoke. "It's everywhere," he said. "Your name, your story, it's everywhere." "I know," Priscilla said. She did know. She could feel it the way you feel weather, not by looking at it, but by the way the air changes around you. "Are you all right?" Harold asked. It was such a simple question, so plain and so direct, and so Harold, who was not a complicated man and who showed his care in the most uncomplicated way available to him, which was to ask. Priscilla thought about it honestly. "Yes," she said. "I think so. I did what I was supposed to do. The rest of it," she gestured vaguely at the air, at the invisible everywhere that her name was currently living in, "is not really mine. I can't carry it. I can only carry the work." Harold nodded slowly. "The work," he repeated. "The work," she confirmed. He sat with that for a moment. Then he stood up, straightened his jacket, and went back to his desk. Priscilla opened the next file on her caseload. It was a small audit flag, a plumbing supply company in Shreveport, a deduction that didn't quite add up. She opened a new spreadsheet. She named it. She began. At exactly 4 a.m. on the second morning, 47 hours and 13 minutes after the freeze had been filed, Elon Musk had not slept. He had tried, twice. He had lain on the narrow couch in the back office in Austin, with his forearm over his eyes and his mind running the way it always ran, when something large and unresolved was sitting in the same room with him, fast and wide and refusing to land anywhere long enough to become rest. The legal pad was on the desk. 14 pages of his handwriting, arrows and circles and question marks, and one long vertical line down the left margin of page 9 that he had drawn without knowing he was drawing it, the pen moving on its own while his mind was somewhere else entirely. He sat up at 3:47 a.m. He put his bare feet on the cold floor. He picked up the legal pad and he read his own notes from the beginning, the way you read a map when you are not lost but want to make sure. He stopped at page 8. He had circled something on page 8 during his first read of Priscilla's document. He had circled it and written a question mark beside it, and then kept reading, and the question mark had been sitting there ever since, blinking at him the way an unanswered question blinks. Patient and relentless, and not willing to be ignored indefinitely. The circled section was on page 47 of Priscilla's document. It was not about tax law. It was not about the financial structure, or the instrument, or the holding companies, or the trusts. It was in a section she had labeled downstream effects, contextual, and it had not been required. Nothing in the legal framework for the freeze order required her to trace what had happened downstream of the structure. She had done it anyway. Because she was Priscilla Vance, and she could not draw a circle without wanting to know what was inside it. What was inside it, in this case, was a table, a clean, plainly labeled table, 3 columns wide. Column 1, the federal program. Column 2, the funding reduction, traced and estimated across 11 years. Column 3, the documented effect. The table ran for 4 pages. Elon had read the table 3 times during his first pass through the document. He had not circled it then. He had kept reading. But some part of his mind had stayed behind on those 4 pages, sitting with them the way you sit with something you are not ready to look at directly, but cannot make yourself leave. At 3:47 a.m. on the second morning, he went back to them. He read the table again. All 4 pages, slowly, one line at a time. One of the lines was about a Medicaid coverage program in Louisiana, a second-line chemotherapy drug called Revlimid, used for lymphoma patients who had not responded to first-line treatment. The funding reduction traced to the period between 14 and 8 years ago. The documented effect in column 3 was written in Priscilla's plain, clear language. Reduced formulary access in state Medicaid program, rationing of treatment courses documented in 3 parish health systems, waitlist periods extended by average of 7 months for eligible patients. 7 months. Elon set the legal pad down on his knees. He looked at the ceiling of the back office. It was a plain ceiling, white. A small water stain in the far corner that had been there since before he moved in, and that he had never done anything about because ceilings were not something he thought about very much. He thought about it now. He thought about how long it had been there without anyone noticing it was wrong. He picked up his phone and called Derek Okonkwo. Derek answered on the second ring, which meant he had not been sleeping either. He had the voice of a man who had been awake for 30 hours and had made a kind of peace with that. "Elon," Derek said. "I need 2 things," Elon said. "First, the Medicaid funding reductions in Louisiana that Priscilla identified in Section 4 of her document. I need the best independent estimate of the total impact over 11 years. Real numbers, not our lawyer's numbers. The independent." "Okay," Derek said. He was already typing. Elon could hear the keys. "Second," Elon said, "find me the name of the best cancer treatment center in Baton Rouge." The typing stopped. Silence on the line. "Derek," Elon said. "I'm here," Derek said carefully. Can I ask why?" "You can ask," Elon said. "Get me the numbers first." Derek got him the numbers. It took 40 minutes. He called 3 independent health policy analysts, 2 of whom were awake because the story had kept everyone awake, and 1 of whom was in a different time zone, and answered immediately. He compiled their estimates and called Elon back at 4:32 a.m. with a figure that sat in the air between them like something solid. Elon wrote it on the legal pad. Then he sat with it for 16 minutes. And then he asked Derek to connect him to Raymond Chu's office. Raymond Chu, Secretary of the Treasury, answered his personal line from his study at home, in a bathrobe that his daughter had given him 3 Christmases ago, and that he wore only when things were bad enough to require comfort. It was dark blue and slightly too large, and he had worn it 4 times in 3 years, and this was the 4th. "Mr. Musk," Raymond said. "Mr. Secretary," Elon said, "I want to make a proposal. Not a legal negotiation, not a settlement discussion, a proposal." Raymond reached for the tea his wife Mei Ying had left on the desk without being asked, because she was that kind of person, and held the mug in both hands. "I'm listening," Raymond said. "The core tax liability," Elon said, "so was separate from Priscilla's penalty projections, which are aggressive and contestable, and we both know it. The core liability. What is the number that your team and my team have both independently arrived at?" Raymond opened the document on his desk. $42 billion, he said. "I want to pay it," Elon said. The tea mug stayed very still in Raymond's hands. "All of it," Elon said. "Not negotiated down. Not in a 10-year payment plan. $42 billion, paid in full within 60 days, with independent verification at every stage." Raymond set the mug down before he spilled it. "I also want a public oversight committee," Elon continued. "Independent, transparent, with full authority to track where every dollar goes and report publicly on its allocation. And I want Priscilla Vance on that committee." The study was very quiet. Outside the window, Washington was still dark. The monuments stood in their floodlit stillness, patient and enormous, the way they always stood regardless of what was happening in the rooms around them. "And the allocation," Elon said. "I want it specific. Medicaid funding restoration in the 3 states she identified. Science education programs in underserved districts, and a federal trust fund for IRS whistleblower protections, so that the next person who finds something like this doesn't have to do it alone and afraid in a regional office at 2 a.m. Raymond Chu was a man who had spent 30 years in public finance. He had sat in rooms where billions of dollars moved and learned to treat large numbers the way surgeons treat blood. As information, serene, not emotion, it was a skill he had built carefully over decades because the alternative was to be undone by the scale of things every single day. The skill was not holding very well right now. "There is one more thing," Elon said. "Go ahead," Raymond said. His voice was steady. He was proud of that. "I want to release a full public statement," Elon said. "Not drafted by my communications team, not run through 4 lawyers and a focus group, written by me, acknowledging that the structure existed, that it was legal but ethically wrong, that Priscilla Vance was right to flag it and right to file the freeze, and that the fight I am choosing not to have, the legal fight I could have had for 3 years and might have won, is not worth winning compared to what it would cost." Raymond was quiet for a long time. "Mr. A. Musk," he finally said, "I have to ask, why? Not strategically, not as a negotiation." The question came from the same place that Al Begay's question had come from in the conference room in Baton Rouge, from the part of a person that wants to understand what is actually happening when something real is happening. Elon looked at the legal pad on his knees, at the number Derek had given him, at the circle on page 8 with the question mark beside it, at the 4 pages of the downstream effects table that he had read 3 times and come back to at 3:47 a.m. because they would not let him go. "Page 47 of her document," Elon said. "She traced what the structure cost, not in legal terms, in real terms. 7 months on a wait list for a cancer drug in Louisiana?" He paused. "She didn't have to include that. It wasn't required. She included it because she wanted the picture to be complete, because she thought that if the picture was complete, someone might actually see it." A silence. "I saw it," Elon said simply. Raymond pressed his hand over his eyes for a moment. Just a moment. Then he straightened in his chair. "I'll have our teams begin the technical documents within the hour," he said. "And Mr. Musk, there was one other thing you mentioned, calling Priscilla Vance directly, before the announcement." "Yes," Elon said. "She should hear it from me first. Not from the news, not from a press release, from me. I'll arrange access to her work line," Raymond said. "Thank you," Elon said. The call ended. Raymond sat in the dark blue bathrobe in his study and did not move for a full minute. Mei Ying came to the doorway, looked at his face, and came in without saying anything. She sat beside him on the small couch against the wall. She put her hand on his arm. "He's paying it," Raymond said. "All of it?" Mei Ying asked. "All of it and more." Mei Ying was quiet for a moment. "Because of her?" she asked. "Because of page 47, Raymond said. He told her about the table, about the 4 pages, about the cancer drug and the 7 months in the Louisiana parishes, and the way Priscilla had written it in plain language so that anyone could understand what had actually happened. By the time he finished, Mei Ying, who operated on the hearts of children for a living and had learned long ago to keep her own heart behind glass where it could not interfere with her hands, was crying, quietly, in the last dark hour before the Washington dawn. She included it because she wanted someone to see it," Mei Ying said softly. "Yes," Raymond said, "and someone did." "Yes," Raymond said again, "someone did." Outside, the first gray light of morning was beginning to show itself at the edges of the sky. Thin and tentative, the way all new light begins, unsure of itself, feeling its way forward, not yet knowing how bright it is going to become. In Austin, Elon Musk was already dialing. In Baton Rouge, a work phone on a desk beside a pothos named Gerald was about to ring, and 47 hours and 59 minutes after the world had changed, it was about to change again. The title of this story made a promise. It promised you agents begging for forgiveness. Here is where that promise gets kept. Not the way you expected. Not with shouting or courtrooms or dramatic press conferences with microphones and bright lights and people reading prepared statements into the middle distance. The begging in this story happened the way most real begging happens. Quietly in ordinary rooms, between people who had to look each other in the eye and say the hardest true thing available to them. It came from 3 directions, and it started with Harold Fitch. You have already read about Harold sitting in the chair beside Priscilla's desk on the morning after the freeze, listening to her walk him through the thread. You have read about him going pale and making phone calls and looking at her across the office with the expression of a man who had just understood something he should have understood sooner. What you have not read is what happened to Harold on the drive home that evening. He was on Route 61, heading south, the radio off because he could not listen to his own name being mentioned in the context of oversight failures and institutional inertia on 3 different stations. The evening was warm and still, and the Louisiana sky was doing what it does in October, going orange and then pink, and then a deep bruised purple that looked painted. Under any other circumstances, Harold would have found it beautiful. He pulled over, not because something was wrong with the car, because something was wrong with him, and he was self-aware enough, at 53 years old, to know that he should not be driving while it was happening. He put the car in park. And he left the engine running because the air conditioning was the only cool thing left in the world. He put both hands on the steering wheel, and he looked at the road in front of him, and he understood something about himself that he had been avoiding for a long time. He had seen the thread. Not all of it. Not the way Priscilla had seen it. But 3 weeks ago, when she had come to him with the early structure, he had felt something. A small, cold feeling in the back of his mind that said, this is real and this is large, and this will be very uncomfortable. And he had looked at that feeling, and he had made a choice. He had called it professional judgment. He had called it experience. He had told himself that structures like that existed for legitimate reasons, and that a first-year agent following an unassigned thread was more likely to be wrong than right. He had told himself a story, and the story had been easier than the thread. He sat on Route 61 for 22 minutes. The sky finished its colors and went dark. The cars went past him in the outside lane, their headlights cutting the dark and then gone. Then he drove home. He hugged his wife longer than usual. He sat at dinner and watched his 2 kids argue about something small and ordinary and felt grateful for the smallness of it. After dinner, when the house was quiet, he sat at the kitchen table with a piece of paper and wrote 2 things down. The first was an honest account of what he had done and why, and which he would give to the internal review team in the morning without being asked for it. The second was what he was going to say to Priscilla. He came to her desk the next morning, before the office filled up, before Harold had even taken his jacket off. He stood in front of her desk and he said it, all of it, without softening any edge of it. Priscilla let him finish completely. Garrett filed his 302 yesterday, she said. Calm, practical, already thinking about the next right step. Harold blinked. I know. I'm filing mine this morning. Good, she said. She looked at him for a moment. Harold, you're not a bad man. You made a bad choice. Those are different things. Harold nodded. His jaw was tight. It shouldn't have taken someone else's courage to show me my own failure. No, Priscilla said honestly. And it shouldn't have. But here we are. She held his gaze. He held hers. Thank you for saying it to my face, she said. He went to his desk. He filed the form. And something in the space between them was different from that morning forward. Not fixed exactly, but honest, which is sometimes better than fixed. The second begging came from Garrett Mulholland. Garrett had 22 years in. He was the kind of man whose commendations filled a wall and whose handshake you remembered. He had been the senior agent Priscilla had approached 3 weeks before the freeze, the one who had told her the structure was probably legitimate, the one who had said above my pay grade without using those exact words, but meaning them exactly. He came to her desk the morning after the announcement. He was a big man, and standing in front of her small desk, he looked somehow smaller than usual, the way large things look small when they are being honest. It was me, he said. I was the one who told you to move on. I wanted to say it to your face before anything else. Priscilla waited. I looked at what you brought me, Garrett said, and I thought, someone would have found this already if it was real. Someone above us. Someone with more clearance and more resources and more years in. And then I understood, sitting in my car at midnight reading Celeste Park's article, that was exactly the problem. Every person who touched the edge of it thought the same thought, that it was someone else's job, that the system would catch it, that someone above the pay grade was already on it. He stopped. Kara, nobody was. Nobody was, Priscilla agreed. You were, he said, at 2 a.m. with a crashing laptop in a plant. Something moved at the corner of Priscilla's mouth. Not quite a smile. "I brought you a form," she said. She slid the 302 across the desk. "File it today. It will help." He picked it up. He looked at it. Then he looked at her. "I came here to apologize," he said. "I know," she said, "and I accept it. But the form matters more right now than the apology. Do both." He did both. He filed the form that afternoon, and the apology lived in the air between them in the permanent way that honest things live. Not gone, not forgotten, not resolved into something clean, but present and real and changing the shape of every interaction they had afterward. Garrett Mulholland went on to become one of the most committed voices inside the IRS for what was later called the Vance Protocol. He did not do it to redeem himself. He did it because he had looked at his own face in the mirror of Priscilla's courage and not liked what he saw, and because the only direction available after that was forward. The third begging was the loudest. It came from the congressional representatives who had spent the first 24 hours calling for Priscilla's removal, demanding hearings on IRS weaponization, using her name in press releases as an example of government overreach and bureaucratic recklessness. After Elon's announcement, after the documents were released publicly, after 14 senior tax law professors reviewed Priscilla's documentation, and the word that appeared most frequently in their assessments was not impressive or thorough or careful. The word was flawless. After all of that, the representatives had to face cameras again. Most issued statements. The statements used phrases like, "upon further review," and "in light of new information," and "we commend the dedication of public servants," and other collections of words designed to travel backward without appearing to move. One man did it differently. His name was Representative Conrad Peel. He represented a wealthy coastal district and had been the loudest and the angriest and the most specific in his calls for Priscilla's removal. He had used her name 6 times in one press conference. And he had called the freeze an act of institutional aggression and a dangerous precedent. At a press conference 2 days after the announcement, a reporter named Tomas Reyes raised his hand. "Congressman Peel," Tomas said, "48 hours ago you called for Agent Vance's removal. Today you're calling her a dedicated public servant. What changed?" Conrad Peel stood at the podium. He straightened his papers. He looked at the microphones. He looked at the cameras. He looked at the reporters. He looked at Tomas Reyes, who was not aggressive and not cruel, but who had asked the question that was sitting in the room, waiting to be asked, and had simply been the person willing to ask it. Conrad Peel was quiet for a moment that lasted long enough to be real. Then he said, "The facts, just that. 2 words, no elaboration, no spin, no prepared language running interference. The facts." The clip of Tomas asking and Conrad answering became one of the most watched 10 seconds of that entire year. Not because it was triumphant, not because it was beautiful, because it was true, because a man had stood at a podium and said the simplest possible true thing, and in that moment, for 10 seconds, it had been enough. A woman in Thibodaux, Louisiana, watched that clip on her phone on a Sunday morning before church. She watched it twice. Then she called her daughter. "Baby," Celestine said when Priscilla picked up, "have you seen the news?" "No, Mama," Priscilla said. "I don't watch the news." Celestine laughed her big warm laugh. The laugh of a woman who had made peace with most of the universe and found the remaining parts more funny than frightening. Good," she said. "Neither should you. Are you eating?" "Yes, Mama." "Real food?" "Mostly." "Come home this weekend," Celestine said. "I'll make a proper pot." "Yes, Mama," Priscilla said. "I'll come home." Things changed after. Not all at once. Not in the clean, complete way that stories sometimes promise, and life almost never delivers. Change in the real world arrives the way the Louisiana seasons arrived. Gradually, imperfectly, with setbacks that make you wonder if it is coming at all. And then one morning you step outside and the air is different, and you understand that something has shifted while you were busy paying attention to everything else. But it shifted. The $42 billion was paid. It took 63 days instead of 60 because moving money at that scale through proper legal channels is not like moving water. It is more like moving stone, heavy and slow and requiring the right equipment and the right people and the right paperwork signed in the right order by the right hands. Derek Okonkwo did not sleep properly for most of those 63 days. He developed a second coffee habit that his doctor has since mentioned at every annual checkup. He does not plan to stop, but the money moved, all of it, every dollar verified by the Independent Oversight Committee, every allocation tracked and reported publicly, every quarterly update posted in plain language on a government website that Priscilla had quietly insisted be written at a reading level that most Americans could actually understand. When she had submitted that request in a 2-paragraph memo, Harold Fitch had co-signed it without being asked. The committee met for the first time 6 weeks after the freeze. Priscilla attended via video from Baton Rouge because she had declined the offer to relocate to Washington, politely and without explanation, because she had her job and her plants and her apartment 3 blocks from the river, and she saw no good reason to trade any of those things for a different desk in a more important city. She brought her glass container with the blue lid to the one in-person meeting she attended in the first year. Red beans and rice, enough for 12. She set it on the conference table beside the water pitchers and the printed agendas and the leather folders that no one ever wrote in. By the end of the meeting, the container was empty. 3 senior Treasury officials had asked for her recipe. She wrote it out by hand on a piece of notepaper and gave it to each of them without making anything of it. The Medicaid funding restoration took 8 months to fully process through the federal and state systems. It was not retroactive. There was no mechanism to give back the 7 months that had been lost, to return the treatment courses that had been delayed, to undo the particular weight of a wait list in the body of a person who is already carrying enough. That was the part that could not be fixed, only acknowledged. And Priscilla acknowledged it in her committee report with the same plain language she used for everything, clearly and without looking away. But going forward, the funding was restored, and a doctor named Dr. Irivette Sampson at a treatment center in Baton Rouge called the committee's general line one Thursday afternoon and left a message saying that 3 patients who had been on the wait list for Revlimid treatment would now be able to begin their courses within the month. The person who received the message wrote it down and put it in the committee's internal file. When Priscilla read it at her desk in the Baton Rouge regional office, she sat still for a moment. She looked at Gerald. Gerald swayed in the air conditioning, the way he always did, patient and green and entirely unimpressed by anything that was not sunlight and water. 3 people, Priscilla said softly. Then she went back to work. The Vance Protocol was adopted by the IRS 18 months after the freeze. It redesigned the framework for how large-scale structural audit issues were flagged, escalated, and protected from the kind of institutional silence that had let the thread sit unfollowed for 11 years. It created formal pathways for field agents to escalate without fear. It required supervisor responses to flag structural issues to be documented and reviewed. It built, in short, a system that assumed the person closest to the thread might be the person most qualified to follow it. Harold Fitch contributed to the escalation section. He was not the most senior person in the room during the drafting sessions. Several people later noted quietly that he was among the most useful. Garrett Mulholland ran the first 3 training sessions on the new protocol in the Gulf Coast region. He stood at the front of the room with his big hands and his wall of commendations and his 23 years of experience. And he told the agents in front of him, most of them young, most of them new, most of them still learning which threads were worth pulling, about a spreadsheet named Thread, and a laptop that crashed twice, and a woman who could not let a number that did not add up simply sit there. He did not frame it as a cautionary tale. He framed it as an instruction. Dr. Anise Moreau at LSU added the case to her graduate tax law curriculum. She spent 40 minutes on the technical elements, which were considerable and which her students needed to understand. Then she closed her laptop and spent 10 minutes on something else. She said the structure was there for 11 years. Dozens of trained, careful, intelligent people touched the edges of it. None of them followed it to the end. Before you leave this room today, I want you to sit with that and ask yourself why. And then I want you to ask yourself what that means about how you are going to do your work. She did not name Priscilla. She did not need to. Celeste Park won a journalism award for the profile piece in the spring. In her acceptance speech, she held the award in both hands and looked at it for a moment before she spoke. The way you look at something you did not expect to hold. She said, "The most important thing about this story is not the $42 billion. It is not Elon Musk. It is a woman who talked to her plant at 2 a.m. in a regional office in Baton Rouge and kept going anyway. That is the story. Oh, that is the one that will still matter in 20 years." Celestine Vance watched the speech on her television in Thibodaux. She had made a pot of red beans and rice even though it was a weeknight and she was the only one home. She watched Celeste Park say those words and she pressed her hand flat against her chest, just the way she had when she first saw Priscilla's name scroll across the screen. She called Priscilla the next morning. A Tuesday, not a Sunday. "Baby," she said, "I saw the speech." "I heard about it," Priscilla said. "She said you talked to your plant." "Gerald is a good listener." Celestine laughed, the big warm laugh, the one that had been in remission for a while and come back stronger, the way the best things do. "Are you happy?" Celestine asked. "Not are you famous. Not are you proud. Are you happy?" The question that matters." Priscilla sat at her desk. Gerald on the left, General Tso on the right, the glass container with the blue lid beside her keyboard, waiting for tomorrow's lunch. Outside the window, the Baton Rouge sky was doing something complicated and beautiful with clouds and light, the way it did most mornings if you remembered to look. She looked. "Yes, Mama," she said. "I think I am." "Good," said Celestine. "Come home Sunday. I'll make the proper pot." "I'll come home Sunday," Priscilla said. She hung up. She opened the next file. The world, imperfect and enormous and slow to change, and changing anyway, turned on. You remember the cliffhanger. It was there from the very beginning. In the prologue, in Derek Okonkwo's voice at 4:47 in the morning, when he said, "It's not what you think." And we're in the note of something that was not panic and not grief, but quieter and stranger than both. In the word he used, which was awe. You have been carrying that word through 8 chapters. Here is what it was for. 3 weeks before Priscilla filed the freeze order, she found something in the documents that had nothing to do with tax law. She had been inside the digital archive of a subsidiary holding company, one of the middle layers of the financial structure, a Delaware entity with a forgettable name that existed primarily to hold other things and leave no obvious fingerprints. She was looking for a specific series of transaction records that she needed to complete the timeline in her spreadsheet. She found the transaction records, and in the same folder, nested inside a document subfolder labeled Personal, Administrative, she found a file that had no title, no date, no recipient, just text, plain font, single-spaced, the kind of document a person creates when they are not writing for anyone else, when they are writing the way you talk to yourself at 3 a.m., when the house is quiet and the ordinary protections of the daylight hours have gone thin. It was 6 paragraphs long. It was written by Elon Musk. Priscilla read it once, quickly, the way you read something when you are not sure you are supposed to be reading it. Then she sat back in her chair. Then she read it again, slowly, the way you read something when you understand that it matters. The letter, because that is what it was. Even without an address or a salutation, it was unmistakably a letter. Described a memory. A specific memory from when Elon was 8 years old. In or outside a hospital in Pretoria, South Africa. A man sitting on the curb in the afternoon heat with a piece of paper in his hands that he could not read, in a language he did not speak, connected to a system he had no way to navigate, about a bill he had no way to pay. The man was not crying, he was not angry. He was simply sitting with the paper in his hands with the particular stillness of someone who has run out of the next thing to do. 8-year-old Elon had watched him from across the street for a long time. He had never forgotten him. The letter described in the plain and unguarded language of a person writing only for themselves, the promise that memory had planted in him, the promise to build things that reached, that closed distances, that made the impossible available to people who had been told it was not for them. When the rockets and the networks and the cars and the clean energy and the drive toward Mars that looked from the outside like ambition or ego, or the hunger of a man who could not stop wanting more. From the inside, in the letter, it looked like a boy watching a man on a curb with a piece of paper. The final lines of the letter said, "I got distracted by the size of things. The numbers got so big they stopped feeling like people. I need to find my way back to the curb." Back to the man with the paper. Back to why I started building in the first place. Priscilla sat with the letter for a long time. She was not authorized to act on it. It was not evidence. It had no legal relevance to the freeze order. It was a private document in a place it had ended up by some combination of administrative carelessness and the way that digital files accumulate in folders over years without anyone deciding to keep or delete them. She could have closed the subfolder and never thought about it again. She could have deleted it from her memory the way she had learned to delete irrelevant information during an investigation. Cleanly, deliberately, making room for what mattered. She did not do either of those things. Instead, she sat in her apartment kitchen at 1 a.m. on a Wednesday with a letter on her screen and Gerald on the windowsill and the river somewhere beyond the city lights doing what rivers do, running dark and steady and without stopping. And she made a decision. She included the letter at the very end of her 114-page document in an appendix, labeled clearly, Supplementary Context, Discoverable. 4 lines of introduction explaining where it had been found and the conditions of its discovery. No argument, no interpretation, no suggestion about what it meant or what should be done with it. Just the letter. Returned to the light, placed back in the hands it had come from, through the only channel available to her, in the only way she knew how. Not as evidence, not as leverage, not as a weapon, as a reminder. Elon found it on page 107. He did not tell Derek. He did not tell Foster Chen or Tate, the bow tie man, or any of the 7 lawyers in the room that day. He read it alone, in the back office with the door closed, and he sat with it the way he had sat with the downstream effects table on page 47, still and long and not quite ready to look away. He had written the letter 4 years ago. He remembered writing it. He had not thought about it since. He had not known it was in the archive. He had not known that anyone else had ever read it. He had not known that a woman in Baton Rouge with a pothos named Gerald and a yellow scrunchie and a spreadsheet that crashed her laptop twice had found it in a subfolder at 1 a.m. and decided without being asked and without any guarantee of what it would do, to put it back in his hands. That was the awe in Derek's voice at 4:47 in the morning. Not just the legal courage, not just the flawless documentation, not just the freeze order filed alone in a regional office by a first-year agent who came in the next morning and ate breakfast at her desk. The awe was for the appendix, for page 107, for the decision Priscilla made at 1 a.m. in her kitchen when she could have closed the folder and chose instead to leave a door open, because she understood something that the law had no language for, that the man who had built the structure and the boy who had watched a man on a curb with a piece of paper were the same person, that the distance between them was not moral failure or greed or the corruption of power. It was the distance that size creates. The way numbers grow so large they stop feeling like people. The way you can lose the curb while building rockets to reach the stars. She had not judged him for the distance. She had simply, quietly, carefully handed him a map back. When Elon paid the $42 billion and formed the committee and stood beside the announcement that he had written himself in plain language without lawyers running interference, he was acting from legal calculation, yes. From strategic reality, yes. From the downstream effects table and the 7 months in the Louisiana parishes, yes. But also from the letter, from the boy on the street in Pretoria, from a woman who found the thread inside the thread and understood that the most important thing she could do with it was not use it, was return it. The agents begging for forgiveness? The loudest one in the end was Elon Musk. Not to the IRS, not to the committee, not to the cameras or the senators or the cable news anchors who had shouted his name for 48 hours. To himself. In a letter he had written 4 years ago and half forgotten. Returned to him at 1 a.m. by a woman he had never met, who had nothing to gain from the returning of it, who had simply believed, the way she believed, that numbers should add up and threads should be followed, and people with lymphoma in Louisiana should not wait 7 months for a drug they needed, that the truth, given the chance, would do its own work. It did. Somewhere in Thibodaux, Louisiana, on a Sunday afternoon, Celestine Vance made a pot of red beans and rice big enough for 2 and waited for her daughter to come home. The blue whale poster was still on the ceiling of Priscilla's childhood room, a little more curled at the edges now, We're still holding on. Theodora, patient and enormous and not going anywhere. Just like the river, just like the truth. And that is the full story of the woman who froze $60 billion, followed the thread nobody else would follow, and quietly changed the world from a small desk in Baton Rouge with 2 plants and a glass container of red beans and rice. Before you go, drop a comment right now and tell us where you are watching from. Whether you are in Louisiana or London, Tokyo or Thibodeau, we want to know. This story traveled around the world and so does this community, and we love seeing where you all are. If this story moved you even a little, if Priscilla's courage meant something to you, hit that like button right now. It takes 1 second and it helps this story reach someone else who needs to hear it today. Someone who needs to be reminded that one person doing the right thing, without anyone watching, can still pull a thread that changes everything. And if you believe that kindness and courage deserve to be louder than everything else on the internet, subscribe to this channel. Every single video we make is built on that belief. Hit subscribe and join a community that still thinks doing the right thing is worth talking about. The next video is on your screen right now. Click it. We will see you there.